Beginning our Daf, Eruvin Daf, begin 8 lines down at the top of the Yomim. We continue the discussion regarding the measurements of how much you need of each food to make an Erev Tchumen, which is 2 meals worth that a person's going to need for Shabbos. Cheers, co-sponsor Bekazik and Chesko to anytime Daf Achayim. Appreciate everyone who's joining us for today's Daf. Some of these we can discuss are specific, proper amounts of different foods for an Erev regarding beer, apples, wine, peaches, dates. Here the picture is precise actually. Then regarding, let's say, things like roasted meat, which is the example the Gemara brings, is that something that's normally eaten with bread? And actually then, as we'll see, then you need a smaller quantity because the amount of that food that you'll eat in the meal, or is it regarding something is that something that's normally eaten separately, and then you would need a larger quantity because like you're eating the meal of roasted meat itself. Some of the key terms and concepts are Ma'isa Ani, which is in the 3rd and the 6th year of Shemitah. Then the second type, instead of taking up and eating that in Yerushalayim, you give it to the poor person. That will discuss some of the halachas of Ma'isa Ani, which then is going to relate back to halacha of Erev. To begin the current daf, 8 lines down, well, Amar Rav says the following statement. He says, Hareini ki ben Azai b'shukei Tiveria. He says, I'm like Ben Azai, which was a famous personality before his days, in the marketplace of Tiveria. Meaning, Rava was in a lighthearted mood, and he said to his students, now I'm very clear, I'm very sharp right now, I'm ready to answer with clarity whoever's going to ask me a question. The way Ben Azai used to give drushes in the marketplace in Tiveria, and there was no one that was as intellectual as he, and he used to say, all the sages, Jewish people, are like a peel of a garlic in front of me, except for this bald one, which was referring to Rabbi Kiva. So he says, like, I'm the same way, ask me any question, I'll give an answer. So one of the rabbis said to Rava, says, Tapuchim, apples for an Erev, Bekama. How many apples do you need for 2 meals worth for an Erev? So Rava said to him, do you go ahead and make an Erev with apples? Which is just interesting that the day that he said that, like, he's going to answer any question, the Gemara is actually going to disprove the one answer, the way it's recorded at least, that someone asked him, he says, what do you mean, you make an Erev with apples? And the Gemara says, what do you mean, Beloi? What, you think you don't make an Erev with apples? But what's not? Learn the Mishnah Masechtas Mikvois that says, all food items, they combine together, there's halacha that although food items do not make a person tamei by touch, there's a unique rabbinic halacha that if he eats tamei foods, then he becomes tamei. If he eats the amount of bechatzi pras, what's a chatzi pras? That's 2 eggs worth of food. Then he becomes now invalid of eating truma, as the Mishnah teaches in the parak later on, the Pei and the Beis, which it says the words of b'chetzi chetzia lifseles agvia. What's b'chetzi chetzia to invalidate a person? Chetzia means a pras. A loaf of bread in Talmudic times was 2 meals worth. Half of that loaf is called kedechilas pras. Kedechilas pras is 1 meal's worth because it's half of the loaf that they have. So chetzi chetzia, half of that half is a chatzi pras. Is a half of a loaf, which is going to be 2 eggs worth because a whole is 8 and a half is 4 and a half of a half is 2 eggs worth. So any type of food could combine. It doesn't have to be of one food item. So too, they also combine any type of food. You could have a bunch of different foods could combine to 2 meals worth of meals for the Erev for an Erev. Now ukabeya, and also if you have an egg's worth of any types of foods, it could be a bunch of foods together. They combine the tamei tumas eichel. There's halacha that food items can become tamei and transmit tamei. It's only if it has the size of an egg, but you could have many different foods together that could combine. Now, so therefore, you see from here, not like what you're saying, Rabbi. We see that apples could be used as an Erev. Which the Gemara says, wait a second, behind my tiyufta, what's the question from this Mishnah that you see not like Rabbi? Everything because it said all food items have all these halachas, and one of the halachas was that all food items will have the halacha of 2 meals worth for an Erev. And apples are edible things. So therefore, you see from that rule that apples will be included in the laws of Erev. That says Gemara, but we had this on the other daf. He says, we don't learn out from general rules. He says except. So you can't learn from here. Kol oichun means to say that apples are b'shogin have the laws of Erev. Where do you see explicitly, not like Rav? Because in that Mishnah, the words it says is they're all going to combine together. It says 2 halachas near each other. It says for the 2 meals worth of the Erev. And if it has the size of an egg, it's going to have the halacha, it could even combine all food items for the laws of Tumah Eichel, which is that food item become Tameh. So as Rashi explained, you see that the laws of Erev are compared to the laws of Tumas Eichel, which sounds like whatever's going to happen to Tumas Eichel will have the halacha that 2 meals worth of it will be combined for the laws of an Erev. Now, and apples are also things that have tumas eichlin. And therefore, since it has tumas eichlin, so therefore that's how we see from the comparison of the Mishnah to the laws of Erev, that it's going to have the laws of Erev, and therefore we see not like what Rabbi was saying. Rabbi said, do you make an Erev out of apples? You see clearly that yes, you do make an Erev out of apples. Well, that's the Gemara of Kama. And how many apples is going to be the 2 meals worth? So Rabbi Nachman says, tabuchim bekav. The amount of apples that you need for 2 meals worth is a kav, a certain measurement, which Gemara says meisve. The Gemara asks in the following brayso. Shimon Elazar, he says, he's talking about the laws of Meiser Ani, which you go in and you divide for the poor people a lot on there's 2 places that they would use to do it. And the place that the Bryce is talking about is what's called alagorin, by the granary, where you're actually out in the fields where you're making the food. On that, the Bryce is telling you, you're not allowed to give to a poor person by the granary less than the measurements that they're talking about over there in that Bryce. Because it says in the pasuk, the nasata lalevi, legeli yasmal, you should give. And less than that's not considered a giving. So Rabbi Shimon Lazar, he explains a lot of different items, how much is considered the minimum giving to fulfill Meiser Ani. He says uchla, which is 1/8 of a litra is a loig, so 1/8 of a loig, of tavlin of spices, that's how much you have to give for spices. The litra yerek, and if it's vegetables, then you give a litra. Vasar gazin, you give 10 nuts. V'chamisha afraskin, you give 5 peaches. V'shnei remind, if you're giving pomegranates, you give 2 of them. The esrog echad and 1 esrog, and you get those, the boxes everyone got. You get this amount of this, and you get, that was what Meiser on, you have to give that amount, minimum amount. Now, the Omar Gursek Bar Dori, he said, Mishmei Menashe Bar Shaguvli, Mishmei Rav, that whatever we just said in this Mishnah, in this Bryce, is V'chein Le'erev. It's also the laws of Erev, which is however much we just said for all these items that you give to the poor person by the granary, that's exactly going to be the amount of food of 2 meals worth that you eat in 2 meals. That's why they gave you in the box, in the Shabbos box. They gave you that amount of each one, the Meiser Ani, because that's going to take you for 2 meals worth. So therefore, the Erev will have the same exact numbers that you're saying for Meiser Ani, whatever the item is, that's going to be the 2 meals worth. Oh, so Bahani Nami, so then apples also, Lahavi Kafraskin, should be like peaches. And what did it say in the Brisa? It said that peaches are going to be 5 apiece. And you don't need a kav. A kav is much more. So then apples should also be in the amount of 5, just like peaches. Why would peaches be any different than apples? So if peaches have 5, so apples should also be. Why is saying it requires a kav? Which Gemara says, no, they are different. Honey, peaches are chashivi, they're significant. So therefore it's sufficient with 5. The honey, but apples, loy chashivi, they're not significant. Whereas Rashi explains, the Gemara tells on the bottom of the Zamid, whatever is a lifton, whatever is a condiment, you don't have to eat a whole 2 meals worth out of peaches or apples. It's however much you would eat the meal with those things. How much of this item would you have in 2 meals worth? So it's not literally eating the meal of this thing itself that it should be from that. Rather, it's lefun chashivuse. It's according to the significance of that item. That if a person will use it as a condiment, so that's how much you have to use, however much bread you would eat with that condiment. Now, if it's something, let's say, is very precious, like peaches, which you're only going to eat for dessert, so that's how much you'll evaluate how much dessert would you eat, which is going to be less. Peaches are more chashiv, people eat it for dessert. How much you going to eat? So much dessert, that's going to be 5 peaches. Apples are not so chashiv like peaches that, dessert, you bring out 1 peach. No, you're going to have much more apples because that's like the meal. You make the apple kugel, the apple strudel, the apple thing. You're going to have much more apples, and therefore apples is bekav, and peaches are 5 of them. And therefore it's not difficult why there's that discrepancy. However, Rabbi Yosef has an interesting complaint. He says, Sharli Mari Rav Menashe Bar Shaguvli. He says, Hashem should forgive Rabbi Menashe Bar Shaguvli for this error. What's the error? If you recall, the halacha was set over the statement. It was Gursag Bar Dori who said in the name of Rabbi Menashe Bar Shaguvli, who said in the name of Rav, that the halacha of the price of Meiser Ani that we quoted, that was also b'chein l'Rav. So on that, Rabbi Yisrael is saying, Hashem should forgive Rabbi Menashe Bar Shaguvli, who, he says, Anam Rita Nahalei, he says, I told him this teaching of Rav, that was saying v'chein la'erev, that the same halacha as the Meiser Ani played an erev. And I told it to him, Amasnit, on the Mishnah, as the Gemara is going to explain which Mishnah. V'hu Amra, but he had told it to Gursig Bar Dari. We had said it in Gursig Bar Dari, saying over the name of Menashe, saying the name of a Rab. But Rabbi Yisrael is saying, actually, I told Rab Menashe this teaching of Rab. And then V'hu Amra, he went and said it to Gursig, a Brisa on a Brisa. That's not, because we have a Mishnah. We had quoted before a Brisa regarding Meiser Ani. He's saying there's a Mishnah in Masechtas Peah that says like this: Ein Peis and Ani Begorin. You don't give to a poor person less by the granary of Meiser Ani If let's say he has a lot of food to divide and becomes a lot of poor people, so he has to give every single person a certain amount, and he can't give less than that to each person, like we said, because it's benos, and it has to be significant giving. Where actually the Mishnah says, but if let's say he had very little, he would just put in front of them and they would just divide it by themselves. But if he has a lot and he's giving each person, so he can't give less than, from each of these items that we're describing, a certain amount. Mechatzi kav chitin, when it's wheat, you can't give less than half a kav. For kav sarin, let's say it's barley, you can't give less than a kav of barley. Remeir says, a lot of the other opinions, they say less than what the Tanna Kama says. It says no chatzi kav sarin. No, only have to give a half a kav sarin, or kav chatzi kusman. If it's spelled, you give a kav and a half. The kav gregris, if it's dried figs, you give a kav of it. Aimana devela. Actually, devela is actually the same thing as gregris. The only thing is after that, in Talmudic times, they used to press it in a circle. That's what's called famous in Elam Mitzvah, say gulei devela. So after it was pressed into the circle, then it's called devela. Now the reason why it's mentioned separately is because then they wouldn't sell it by volume anymore; they would sell it by weight. So therefore, instead of being called a kav of gregris, then it was a mana of pressed figs, because then it actually changed in how they would market it. So that's how much you have to give of the pressed figs. Rabbi Kiva says, no, not so much. You only have to give pras. You only have to give a half of a mana. V'chatzi loig yain, you have to give a half a loig of wine. Rabbi Kiva says, no, half of that, which is reviz. And revish, you have to give a quarter loig of oil. And Rabbi Kiva says, no, Kiva mishminis, you have to give an eighth of a loig of oil. Now, Shar kol ha'peiros, regarding all other produce, all other fruits, Amar Bashal, he says, Kadesh Yimkrim, it's the amount that you could sell that, and you could buy from it 2 meals worth, because all those other fruits you're not going to even eat by a meal, so at least then you could be able to sell it and get 2 meals worth of it. That's the Mishnah. Now, that's what V'amar Rav had said on that Mishnah, and also, whatever these laws of Maisani, that's how much you're having in 2 meals worth, that would also apply to the laws of Eruv. So Hashem should forgive him that he taught him on the Brisa, but really I had said on this Mishnah. Says the Gemara, what's better than Mishnah than the Brisa? Why was Rav so bothered on Rav Menashe that he's saying it on the Brisa? Whatever the Mishnah was saying, you're right, the Brisa wasn't talking about, but they're just talking about different cases. They're just mentioning different types of items, but not contradicting each other. So he's saying that these items have the measurement with this, and these items have the measurement with this. Why was he so bothered? If he was bothered because in the Brisa, one of the cases was spices, and so he's telling you regarding the meiser on these spices. But in spices are not things that are eaten, and Rav Yosef was holding that no, you can't teach the halacha of Rab on that Brisa because you cannot make an eruv with spices. So v'chein la'eruv cannot be going in that Brisa because then it's including spices. So I'm not saying about in this Mishnah that you're quoting is any better. It says wheat and barley. Then you can't eat the wheat and barley itself. You can eat bread out of that, but you can't eat the barley. And that's also one of the things that you mentioned. So why is that any better? So Elorada says the Gemara, what bothered Rabbi Yosef was like this. Because in the Mishnah was mentioned of chatzi loig yain. It said, one of the cases was regarding that of wine, it said a half a loig of wine. A half a loig of wine is 2 revi'as. When we have in our cup that we make kiddush on, and we'll actually explain later on, is a revi'as. It is a revi'as of loig. So half a loig is 2 revi'as. Now, as the Gemara is going to shortly say, we have a different teaching of Rav that says this halacha of Amar Rav. He says ma'arvin b'shtei revi'as shel yain. He says you make an eruv with 2 revi'as of wine, which is a big chiddush because generally regarding wine we usually make measurements of just revi'as itself. Oh, so therefore we obviously know that Rav had said his teaching v'chein le'eruv on the Mishnah because that's where he got his chiddush, because it says by the laws of meiser that how much meiser ani do you give for the wine is going to be 2 revi'as. So to be equally hard. The fact that Rav required so much wine for the laws of eruv, Shema we could infer is that Kiyom Rav v'chein le'eruv. When did Rav say the v'chein le'eruv? Ahom masnitni kamar. He obviously said on this Mishnah because it's this Mishnah that says that by Meiser Ani you have to give 2 revi'as. So he's comparing the laws of eruv. Shema obviously was from this Mishnah because that will tell him that chiddush that for wine, for eruv you're going to have 2 revi'as, and because if you said on the Brisa we would never know where he gets the chiddush from. That's what bothered him. Because if you're going to see it on the Brisa, no one's going to know where Rav got his chiddush of his teaching. That for eruv you're going to have 2 revi'as of wine. Now the Gemara goes back to explain different parts of the Brisa that we said. So the mazon shtei sudis la'eruv. We said in the Brisa that in a meal, so you have to have 2 meals worth, and for an eruv, we said all types of payers, all types of food could combine to be that share of 2 meals worth. Now, so Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef thought to say that until you have a meal of each one. Okay, you could combine different things, but 1 meal's worth of this food and 1 meal worth of this food. But let's say you have 3-4 different items, where you're not going to have even a whole meal of one thing, then that wouldn't work. Which Rabbi said, no, even half, a third, or quarter, doesn't make a difference. It doesn't mean that you have to have at least 1 meal's worth of each thing. You could combine 100 different items, even if it's not going to be a whole meal's worth on that itself. As long as you have 2 meals worth, that's going to be okay. Now, Gufo, we learned also before that Amar Rav, he said this chiddush on ma'arvim b'shti reviyah shel yain, that you make the eruv is going to be 2 reviyahs of wine. And that says the Gemara, umi bein and kulahai. Do you really need to have that much wine for the eruv? But B'tanya, in the Brayso of Shimon Lazar, he says, yain, how much wine do you need for an eruv? It's kadir lechel bay. It's the amount to eat with it, which is if you take the bread and you soak it in the wine of 2 meals worth of bread, that's how much wine you need to have. How much chemetz, how much vinegar? It's kadir tavel bay. It's the amount that how much meat can you dip into that vinegar to eat for 2 meals worth of meat. So to Zaysim or B'tzalim, olive, we're going to explain all these cases. Zaysim Tzom is olives and onions. Is kadei lechel behen shtei sudas. Is the amount of using it as a condiment of bread with these olives, and these are all items that you don't have to eat the whole meal of these things, because you don't need a meal out of them. But however much meat or bread, whatever it is that you'll eat with these things, that's how much you have to have. But one thing, the difficulty is, you told me that in this brisa that you have to have enough wine to dip bread into it. That's much less than 2 reviyahs, and the 2 reviyahs is obviously drinking those cups itself. So that seems to contradict what Rabbi said. You need 2 reviyahs of wine for the eruv. So the Gemara is not a contradiction. We're talking about different types of wine. Hasam over there in the brisa it says k'dei lechel bay. How much bread you need to eat with that wine is b'chamer mavashel. We're talking about cooked wine. That's something that is considered that you're going to use it as a condiment. But regular wine, which you cannot use as a condiment, you need the amount of wine that you'll drink, 2 meals worth of it, which are 2 reviyahs according to Rav, and therefore it's not a difficulty. We're talking about different types of wine. Now the next item we said was Amamar. We said in the Brayso of Chemetz how much vinegar you need. It's kadil talabo is the amount of that you'll use it as a dip for 2 meals worth. So Amar Rav Gidl Marav, he says what it means to say is kadil talabo mozn shtei sudas shel yarik. It means the amount of if you have a whole meal, you're on a vegetarian diet. The whole meal is from vegetables, so now the 2 sudas are from vegetables, and then you're using the vinegar as a dip. However much vinegar you're going to need for that dipping, that's how much it's going to be for 2 meals worth to be considered as your eruv for the vinegar. Now, however, those who want to say that I'm going to give them a rab, no, it's yarik hanechel b'shtei sudas. We're talking about the amount of vegetables that you'll have as a side dish in 2 meals, but the meal is actually of bread. That's how much vinegar you need to have for that salad, which obviously much less vinegar than the first version. It's not the whole meal is of salad, but it says the salad is like a side dish, and then you're having the vinegar as a dip. That's how much vinegar you'll need if you want to use that as an eruv for 2 meals worth. Another item the Brayso had said was zaysim u'bitzalim, was olives and onions. Kedei lechel behen mazon shtei sudas. It's the amount of olives and onions you'll have in 2 meals worth. Now says Gemara, can you even make an eruv out of onions? But B'tanya in the Brayso of Shimon Lazar, he says, Pamacha Shabbos Renei Bar Disker. One time Remeir was in the town of Disker for Shabbos. But one person came in front of him on Shabbos, meaning he came from out of the Tchum, but he came there through an eruv that he had made from his place to he wanted to go to Tivin. Now, the place of Disker was 2,000 amos between his eruv and Tivin. So he was already out of his Tchum, but he was already on the next 2,000 amos. What happens is when you make an eruv, you could go another 2,000 amos, so he's on his way to the second 2,000 amos, and on the way, he passed through Disker. Now, on that Amalei, so he said to Remeir, Rebbe, Rafti b'bitzalim l'tivin. He says, this is not really why I usually can't come here on Shabbos, but I made an eruv to go with onions to Tivin. Meir made him stay within his Dalet Amos for the whole Shabbos. He didn't let him leave his place from his Dalet Amos from where he had asked him the question, because Meir held it wasn't an eruv, because you're not allowed to make an eruv with onions. So it comes that he had gone already out of his Tchum out of an eruv, and the Mishnah later on, the Amid tells us, you only get Dalet Amos, you can't move out of 8 feet. So where you see the onions are not a valid eruv. How can the Brayso say ma'arvim bebitzalim u'bezeisim? So the Moloikash is not a difficulty. This of Remeir is talking about ba'olim. We're talking about the leaves. They're not significant and they're bad to eat. That the Brayso that says that you can make an eruv is being moist, is with the bulb itself. That's something that could be used. The time like in the Brayso, achol bitzal vehishkem ameis. If someone gets up in the morning and if he eats onions and he wakes up in the morning and he dies, in we don't say what did he die from, because it's harmful to eat. He says, we didn't learn this only by the leaves. I'll be moist, but the bulb itself, then less than, but we're not bothered by that and therefore, again, that resolves the contradiction. Depends what part of the onion that a person is eating and making an eruv out, it would be an eruv or not. Now, however, the Gemara makes another qualification, but we also didn't say this regarding onions that's going to kill a person, only if, as we continue in the days, only if it didn't grow at least a zeres, which is like a half of an amma, then there's a certain poison in the onion. But if it already grew the size of a zeres, then less lamba, they were not bothered by it. And one more qualification, Papa says, it's only poisonous, it's only harmful for a person only if you didn't drink beer. If you drank beer, then less lamba, we're not bothered with that. And actually, trying to in the brisa, a person should not eat onions because of the sap that's poisonous, that's harmful in the onion itself. And the Ma'aser Reb Chanina, there was a story of Reb Chanina. He ate half of an onion, and he had half of this sap inside. He got sick and he was literally on the edge of dying. And his colleagues went and beseeched mercy for him, and he survived because the moment needed him, he was needed, and therefore, as I always tell people in these times, if people need you, that's a schus. So the moment needed him, so therefore he survived that situation. So again, therefore it's going to kill a person, but it's only if it's the olin, and only if didn't grow the size of a zeres, and only if you don't drink beer. Continue on this theme about regarding the shiur of different items for an eruv. So Amr B'Zera Mishmul says shecher regarding beer, ma'arvin bay, you can make an eruv out of it. Another halacha actually regarding beer, once we mentioned it, u'peisla as a mikvah. It invalidates a mikvah like other mayim she'uvim, which is if it's drawn water, if it's not natural waters, rain waters, then it invalidates a mikvah if it didn't fill up with 40 leg yet, b'shleishas lugim, with 3 lug. If you pour in beer before it fills up with 40 leg, it's going to invalidate it. Now, masculine of Kahana pshita. Rav Kana actually asked on this halacha of the mikvah halacha first. He says obviously it's going to be invalidating the mikvah. What's the difference between beer or colored water where that invalidates and beer is the same thing? Beer is essentially colored water, so obviously it's going to invalidate. That now like when the Mishnah says it's mikvah. Rabbi Yisrael says made seva colored water. Placeness a mikvah b'shleishas lugin. It invalidates a mikvah with 3 lugin. So that's what beer is. It's colored water. So of course, at least that. So of course it's going to invalidate. Somebody said, no, hasam over there, mayed tzibah mikri, it's called colored water. So you see that intrinsically it's defined as water. Hacha shechur ikri, here it's not called colored water, it's called beer. And therefore you would have thought to say it doesn't have the designation of mayim, it's only a bad water that invalidates. And even so, that's the chiddush I was saying it's going to invalidate the mikvah. Because actually, as Tosh even clarifies a little bit more, Tosh says in the Masechtas Makos, the Gemara tells us that diluted wine does not invalidate a mikvah, even if it has 3 lug of wine, drawn water in the wine, because we're talking about diluted wine. So that's what Tosh says. No, beer is different because primarily beer is made out of water, and also he says that there it's called chamer maziga and it's called wine, and a peri does not invalidate a mikvah. Here, beer is essentially water, and therefore it is going to be invalid. But you wouldn't have known that. You would have thought, okay, it's called beer, and it's not ma'id tzivi. That's the chiddush that we're saying that no, it's going to invalidate a mikvah. Now, regarding the first halacha that we mentioned, which is why we brought in, ubekam na'arvin. Now, regarding how much beer do you need to make an eruv, so it's a little bit of a cheshbon over here. Savar Rav Acha Bereder Rav Yisuf Kameder Rav Yisuf L'meimah. He thought to say, betrain rivi shechra, with 2 quarters of beer. Now, what quarters? So Rashi explains, we're talking about 2 loigin. A loig is a quarter of a kav. There's 2 revius that we mentioned, basically. When we say revius, we usually mean the revius of a loig, and then there's another revius, which is a loig is a revius of a kav. So when he's saying a revius over here, a revius of a kav. So 2 revius of a kav would be 2 loigim, because a loig itself is a revius of a kav. That's what he thought to say how much beer you're going to need to have. Why? Kednam, like we learn the Mishnah Masechta Shabbos. The Mishnah says, Hamitzi yain, if someone carries out on Shabbos, kedei mezigas hakleis, the amount of diluting a cup, meaning however much of raw wine you're going to put in the cup to dilute it with water, that's how much wine you're chayav for carrying out on Shabbos, because that's considered a significant amount. Now, we learned the Brisa explaining that Mishnah, kedei mezigas kais yafa. What type of cup are we talking about? A refined cup. My kais yafa. What do we mean a nice cup? It means a kais shel bracha. It means when you make kiddush, abdul, whatever the kosher bracha is, that's how much it is. Now, the Amr of Nachman and Rabbi Abdullah, he says kosher bracha. How much do you need to have when you make kiddush or whatever kosher bracha? It has to have a quarter of a revius. Now, what Rashi here actually says, it means to say a quarter of a leg of raw wine which would then, when you fill it up with 3 parts like the Gemara says, so that when you dilute it, you're going to actually come to revius. When you're putting a quarter revius, you can end up being by revius, because the Rabbi said, the Amar Rabbi says, Kol Chama, any wine, if you don't have 3 parts of water to 1 part of wine, Lav Chama, it's not wine. So if you're putting in a quarter revius of raw wine, you can end up putting in 3 parts water. It's going to make it for the total revius, because 1 quarter adding 3 more quarters is to make the whole revius. Now, just to point out, Rashi here makes it sound like that the revius is a loy, and then in the Ksav Yad, and many Gemaras they bring down here on the side, the Rashi ultimately retracts, and Taisa also says it. So, just not to get complicated, unless you're looking at Rashi, there's 2 types of revius. There's the revius of a loig and revius of a kat. Rashi here makes it sound like that we're discussing the raiva revius is getting you to a loig. When you have the final product, when you're adding the 3 parts water to the 1 part wine, is going to get you to a loig. That's the revius, because that's a revius of a kav, and you're putting a raiva of a loig of raw wine, getting you to that. But Taisa points out we don't pass on Rashi himself elsewhere also doesn't say like that. Our revius is actually a revius of a loig. So when you have your raiva revius, you have a quarter of a revius of a loig. So it's much less. Meaning when you put in 3 parts water into 1 part wine, you're actually getting what we call a revius is revius of a loig. So it's a lower revius. It's not like, but be that as it may, that's not the main part of the raya. The Gemara continues and says, okay, that's regarding wine. So wine needs a raiva revius, whichever one that is. Now, B'Ktani Seifa, and the Seifa of that Mishnah in Hamaitzi Yayin, the Mishnah says, okay, B'Shar Kalamashkin, what's the law of carrying out, regarding all of the beverages? That's revius. So let's say that would be a loig, a quarter of a loig for wine, and for carrying out other beverages is going to be a loig itself, whichever revius we're going in. Now, B'Chol HaSheichan, also all water that you spill out, wastewater, is also revius. Says Rav Yosef the following raya. Medahasam, from there regarding the laws of carrying on Shabbos. Al Chad Arba, you need to have, for whatever the measurement of carrying out wine, which was 1, you need to have 4 times that amount for beer, because by wine we said it's revius. By other beverages which include beer, you said revius. So it's a ratio of 4 to 1. So hachanami. So here also we're going to the laws of Eruv, Al Chad Arba. So there should also be a ratio of 4 to 1, because you see that beer is 4 times less than the significance of wine. So you have to have 4 times the amount of wine. If you recall, we had said from Rav regarding the laws of Eruv, how much wine do you need to have? You need 2 revios, which is a half of a loig. So obviously beer, if you know it's simple math, how much is that going to be for that of beer? A half of a loig times 4 is going to make you 2 loig of beer. So therefore, Rav Yisrael said, 2 loig is going to be the measurement, 2 revios, 2 of whatever, Rav Yisrael said, between rivi shichra, 2 rivi of beer. What does he mean by rivi? As Rashi explained, rivi of a kav, which is 2 loig, because that's 4 times that of the amount of wine, which is only a half a loig, which is 2 revius of a loig, which is a half of a loig itself. Which Gemara says no, it's not necessarily correct. Why isn't it correct? Because Hasam over there, by the laws of carrying on Shabbos, who debatzim ahachili chashim, the laws of carrying, if you recall from Masechta Shabbos, it talks about what's a chashivas. We're talking about in the Maisa Hitzah. In the act of carrying, it has to be significant carrying. What's considered significant, that's going to make you liable. So that's how much wine is significant, and that's how much beer is significant. The laws of Erev Loi. It's not the same criterion. It's Davidi. It's what people normally eat in 2 meals worth. Not regarding significance. So Davidi Inji Deshasi Kasa, people will generally drink a cup of only a revius of a loig of beer. For 1 in the morning meal, but Kasam Panya 1 in the evening meal. So essentially it's going to come out that 2 revios are going to be for the 2 meals for some chila elavaya, and they rely on that. So therefore you don't have to have 2 loig in a beer, you're only going to have 2 revios in a beer, because there's no raya from the laws of Haitzah and Shabbos, which is significant. It's just what do people have, and people will have just a cup of beer by each meal, which is a cup of revios, which actually will come out to be the same as wine, and therefore you don't have to have 4 times the amount. Now the Gemara continues and says, Tamar and Bekama, how much dates do you have to have for 2 meals worth to be the Erev on Shabbos? Amar Rav Yisrael says, tomorrow is Bakav, the amount of Bakav. So Rav Yisrael says, Menam Minilai says, how do I know this? The Tanya, look at the Brisa. The Brisa says like this, Achel Gregors, if someone ate the dried figs of Truma by mistake, so the halacha is, he has to pay back to the Kayan the amount that he ate. Now, let's say Vashilam tomorrow. Let's instead of paying back figs that he ate, he pays back dates. Says the Brisa, Tavel bracha, a blessing should come on him for paying back with dates. Now, says Gemara, how do we understand the case of the Brisa first? If he's paying back monetarily, meaning the achol minei bezuzah, he ate a zuz worth. Not talking about value, we're talking about value. And when he pays back the dates, which are actually more expensive than figs, he doesn't pay them back according to the volume, rather he pays back bezuzah with money in the value. So says the Gemara, then my Tavel bracha, why would the Brisa say that, a blessing should come on him? What do you mean, bezuzah achol, he ate a zuz worth, bezuzah kamasham, he's paying back a zuz of that, so it's actually paying back, let's say, less dates, but it's just the same amount of money, so what would be the big bracha? Elalad, rather he wants to prove, must be the Brisa, lafi mida, no, he's paying back according to value. Meaning the achol when they grieve with the gregors, he ate a grieve, which is a measurement of gregors, the shabi of zuz, that's actually where of zuz, because masham and grieve tomorrow, and tomorrow he's paying back a grieve of dates. Oh, the shabi arba, that's 4 zuz worth of that value. And you see that the Brisa says, blessings should come on him. So you see that obviously tomorrow madifi, that dates are more precious than figs. Now, what about that? We had learned in the Mishnah before that said regarding the poor person by the granary, when you're giving a meiser ani, how much do you have to give him of the gregis? We said you give a kav. And Rav said that the laws of meiser ani will apply to the laws of Erev too. He said v'chein le'erev. So therefore, if you're telling me that a kav of gregis is sufficient for an Erev of 2 meals worth, so for sure for tomorrow for date, for sure it's going to be sufficient. Meaning it's more chashiv. The more chashiv an item is, the less you need to have. So at least a kav is going to be enough. You're not going to have to do more than a kav. That's what Rabbi wants to prove from there. Maybe even you would even need less. But for sure it's going to be sufficient with a kav of tomorrow. Which Amalei Abai actually rejects the right. Says no, from here you cannot prove that tomorrow are better. And maybe actually gregors are better. And maybe it would actually have to have more dates for an Erev on Shabbos. Because actually this guy is paying back according to how much money he had eaten from the Truma by mistake. The truth is he ate from him a zuz worth. He paid back a zuz worth. So then you asked, am I Tavel bracha? What's the whole blessing that's coming on his head? It's simply because of selling. The he ate something that usually people don't jump to buy. And he's giving back something that people jump to buy. So it's simply because a Tavel bracha, because it's just going to go quick. But regarding laws of Erev, maybe you actually would need to have dates more than that of a kav, because maybe it is less chashiv than figs, and if it's not a raya for what you're trying to bring to the laws of Erev. Now, continuing with different items, shtisa, which is a type of food that's made from roasted grain that they make flour out of it, which they dry it in the oven, and they make flour out of it, and they put honey into that dish. So Amr of Acha B'Pinchas, he says the measurement is shrei shargushi, 2 spoonfuls. 2 spoonfuls of sugar, you know what I'm saying? That's like a very sweet thing. That's how much a person would have, 2 meals worth. Kisani, which is roasted grain. What's the measurement? Amabai, it says trei buni de pumpadisa. It's 2 measurements that they have in pumpadisa. That's all you need to have for 2 meals worth, and that's going to be enough for an air. Now, related to this, Amabai says, Amali Amy says, my mother told me, Hani Kisani, this roasted grain that we just mentioned, Malu Laliba, it's good for the heart, Umavati Machshavta, and it stops a person's thoughts of worry. And that's a good natural medication for anxiety. And then other teachings that Abai says, my mother told me, if someone has a weak heart, you should bring meat from the right thigh of a ram. They should bring the dung of cattle from Nisan time, and that will help for his weak heart. Now, if he doesn't have animal dung, he should bring the twig of a willow branch, and he should make a coal out of it, and he should roast the meat on that, and he should eat it, and he should drink after it, diluted wine, and that will help him for his weak heart. Now, the Gemara concludes with a very important qualification that we were taking for granted all along in explaining the laws of Erev for 2 meals worth. I'm going to read the Mishnah. Koshu lifton, whatever is a condiment, meaning you don't eat a meal out of hummus, right? But it's used as a condiment. Then the measurement is kedei lechol boy, to eat as when you're dipping your bread into it, 2 meals worth. How much of that would you have in 2 meals worth? That's how much you need. Kosher any lifton, whatever is not a condiment, it's an item that you eat by itself. Then kedei lechol he menu. Then it's the amount you'll eat of it. If you would eat the whole meal out of that thing, how much of that would you need to have? Which is obviously much more. Now let's say basar chai, raw meat, which is not a condiment. Then you need kedei lechol he menu. However much meat would you eat of raw meat as 2 meals worth itself? Now, basar tzoli, regarding roasted meat, so we have a machlekes if that's considered as a condiment or not. Rabbah says kedei lechol boy. He says it's the amount to eat of it, with it. meaning to say you're not eating the roasted meat itself, you're eating it with bread, with other things. Rabbi Shloimy says, it's the amount to eat of it, which he says, people eat roasted meat by itself. So Rabbi Yisrael says, he says, where do I get this from the people who eat roasted meat by itself? He says, because these Persians, they eat pieces of roasted meat, without bread. So you see people eat just the meat itself. They're keto, who knows, whatever they're on, they're eating just Atkins. They only eat meat. This is what the Persians do. You see that they eat it without bread. So you have to have that much meat. Somebody like, says, what do you mean? What's your right? Your proof is on the Persian. Persian are the majority of the world. But Vatnan, which actually a Bryce, we learned that Big Danim is going to prove that we don't go based on the majority. And if the majority don't do that, we're not going to measure based on them to have the stringency of having that much meat. Big Danim, the garments of paupers, which are small, are 3 by 3 finger breadths. They're makabel tumalaniim. The amount of that it is for a poor person, which he has very small garments because he's poor, and that's already going to be considered as a beggar to become tummy. Whereas big dashim, the garments of wealthy people, where their smallest garment, even their hand towels, are going to be 3 by 3 hand breadths. So then it's makabel tumah only last year, meaning even for the wealthy, that's when it's going to become makabel tumah. But as we continue to of the big dashir, but the garments of wealthy people. We don't have the requirement for the poor people. In other words, for the poor people, they don't need to have 3 tfachim squared like the wealthy people have to have. Rather, since it fits for them, because they're poor, for 3 finger breadths, we go based on them. So here also, even though the Persians, that yes, they're going to eat roasted meat by itself, it's not a condiment, but for us it's not a condiment. So for us, it should be enough with the smaller measurement that we only eat with it, which is much less because we're eating bread meals, and with that we'll have some roasted meat with that. But we don't have to have the larger measurement. And says maybe going to say, no, what do you mean? Here we go stringently. In other words, since it fits for the poor people, we'll go stringently. We'll say yes, the smaller measurement of 3 finger breadths squared will be makabel tumah. Maybe here we would also say you go stringently. In other words, that until you have the amount, meaning you have to have that everyone uses as a condiment. Only then will you go ahead and use it for the smaller share. But since some people eat it by itself, the roasted meat by the Persians, maybe then we'll go based on the larger measurement that the whole meal has to be on that. And that's as the Gemara know about Tanya, but we learn the Brisa, but the laws of Eruv, that obviously refutes this. Because Rabbi Shloimy Schwartzberg, he says, a sick person, an elderly person, the way we qualify their Eruv is according to how much they eat. Since the elderly person, a sick person, they don't eat so much. So even though a regular person, it's not going to be 2 meals worth, but for them, it's going to be their 2 meals worth. It's going to be a valid Eruv. So now, let's say a ravenous person, this guy has such an appetite, the guy eats so much, 10 meals worth at every single meal. We don't evaluate based on him. We go besuda beinishal kaladim. We evaluate by a medium-sized meal of a regular person. So you see that even though this hungry person eats so much more, it's still going to be sufficient with a medium-sized meal. So obviously we go based leniently, even though, meaning we don't go stringently when they're in the minority, we're going to go based on what's normal. So you see clearly that by Eruv, we don't go l'chumrah. So therefore says the Gemara remains kasha, definitely is a difficulty on the proof of Rabbi Yisrael. Rabbi Yisrael was trying to prove that by roasted meat, it's the amount that you eat it by itself, because he said, you see by the Persians that they eat roasted meat by itself, they don't eat with bread. And that Abaye says, who cares? They're not Ruba the Alma. And we go based on the majority. In other words, at least we go based on what we are. We're not Persians. We don't eat meat by itself. We wouldn't have to go ahead and do the stringent measurement of how much would you eat just a meal of roasted meat. As we see by the laws of air, we don't go based on certain minority groups. Even the guy himself, you don't go when he's a Ravs, and you're going to go based on normal people. And for sure, us, where we don't eat roasted meat by itself in Talmudic times. Therefore, it definitely would seem to be enough, like the other opinion said, to go ahead and eat it with bread, and that you wouldn't have to eat it as a meal itself, the way Rabbi Yisrael was trying to say, K'tei Amen. Some of these spoke on today's Daf and Eruvin Daf Chavtes, which I just went to my old review. I'm going to this again. Was Ma'avin, we started off with the item that we started off with that regarding making Eruv is that of apples. So that was, he said, I'm like Benazi B'Shukim B'Tfei, so I can answer any question. So the Gemara had said, no, you could make an Eruv with tapuchim. But the Gemara first said it's not a raya from the cloud that it says Kol Eichlin there on the star from the Eruv, because as we had said from Yechon in the previous Daf, Kol Eichlin, okay, maybe that means apples, because you can't learn now from clothes. No, the raya that you can make an Eruv out of apples was because in that price that we learned that it compares Eruv to the laws of Tumas Eichlin. And apples are things that are Makabel Tumah, and therefore that's how you know that it's included in the laws of Eruv. So what's the measurement? So the Gemara said the measurement was Bikav. Now, what do you mean? Don't we say by peaches that it's enough with 5 peaches because we compare the laws of Eruv to the laws of Meiser Ani, and by Meiser Ani it says it's up with 5 peaches. No, because peaches are chashiv, that you can have for dessert, that we give a little bit. But apples are not as chashiv, and therefore you can have much more in 2 meals worth, and therefore it's going to require a kav. Then we said that this halach of Rab, that he compared the laws of Meiser Ani to the laws of Eruv, was said specifically on the Mishnah and not on the Brisa. So the Gemara says, what's the difference? The Brisa and the Mishnah were saying the same things, it was just about different items regarding what their measurements were. No, because that's where he learns out his halacha of a unique, of regarding Eruvin, that by wine it's actually 2 revi'is of wine, which generally for wine we always use 1 egg. So we said that that's the chiddush of the halacha. We only know it from that Mishnah because that Mishnah said regarding the laws of wine that it's the Meiser Ani Shtei Revi'is. We wanted to say specifically on that Mishnah because the Brisa you wanted to know where Rav got his teaching from. Wait a second, how could Rav say actually that you say by wine 2 revi'is? And don't we have a Brisa that says by wine it's kedei lechel by, the amount you'll eat with it, which is much less because you're taking the bread and dipping into the wine. That's not 2 revi'is, and the revi'is is you're gonna have drinking that much in the cup in a meal. So, which is because you only soak in the bread 2 meals worth. So the Gemara says no, that Brisa come up b'chamar mavashel, like cooked wine. Cooked wine, use it as a condiment, as a dip. That's how much you're gonna, which is much less. But when you have regular wine, you don't use it with bread. That you're gonna have to have much more of how much you would drink in a meal. We had mentioned that regarding vinegar, it's the amount of dipping in, using it as a dip. So we had 2 different versions. Either that the whole meal is of yerek, of vegetables, and that's how much you're gonna need the vinegar as a dip. Or no, the amount of vegetables eaten in a meal, which is that of bread meal, and then you're having some salad as a side dish, how much vinegar would you have to have for that? That would be 2 meals worth. We also said that olives and onions are the amount that you'll eat with them in a meal, meaning lalaf, like Rashi says, as a condiment together with the bread. Remeir says to someone that made an eruv out of onions, he says, no, you're not allowed to go any further because he had made the eruv out of onions. Yeah, that's talking about by the olive, where that's not so significant and they're inferior, and like we said, they could actually kill a person, that's why it's not valid. So he said it kills a person when it's the olim, it's the leaves. It also didn't grow a zeres, and also you didn't drink beer. Then it would kill a person because of what the Gemara calls nachashabai, which is some type of a sap that's in the onions. Then we said regarding sheikh, regarding beer, so we said 2 halachas regarding it. We said that you can make an eruv out of beer, and also it invalidates a mikvah by being 3 lugin. Now what's the chiddush? Why is it it's not going to be any different than mayid etzivi, than dyed water. So the Gemara said, no, the chiddush is it's not called. It's not called mayid etzivi, it's called beer. So you would have thought to say it's like diluted wine, which is not invalidated mikvah. That's the chiddush that no, essentially it's just colored water. That's what beer is, and therefore it's going to invalidate the mikvah. Now regarding the laws of eruv, they thought to say that betrayin rivi of shichur, the 2 quarters of which is 2 legin, because it's a river of a kav. So 2 legin of beer we thought would have to be required for the eruv. And why? Because just like by the laws of Shabbos, by Haitzah, we find that wine is only a revi'is of revi'is, but beer is times 4 is a revi'is itself. So we thought to say the same would be by eruv. Now we had said by wine that it's 2 revi'is in it. Beer would be times 4 of that, which would take you out to be 2 leg, because it's a half a leg is 2 revi'is, and 2 revi'is is a half of a leg, and therefore times 4 would take you out to be 2 legin. Now that's what he meant when he said 2 revi'is, because a leg is the revi'is of a kav. So therefore he thought that that's how much beer you have to have. The Gemara says no. The Gemara rejects that and says loy. It's not the case. Over there by the laws of Haitzah and Shabbos, less than that is not chashiv. Haitzah has to be a double chashiv. Here we're talking about what people normally do by a meal. By a meal, people generally drink just a cup of beer, and therefore it would be enough for just 2 revi'is, and you wouldn't have to have 4 times that amount for the laws of the eruv. We said regarding dates, that Rabbi Yosef, he wanted to say that it's the amount of a kav, and his right was from a brisa. The brisa says if someone ate dried figs and he paid back with dates, tavel bracha. Why tavel bracha? If he's paying back the same amount in value, so what's the difference? Oh, it must be it's in measurement. So obviously he's paying back the same amount of measurement in dates. Obviously the dates are obviously better, and that's why they're more expensive. And if you're paying back the same volume, you're paying back something more expensive. And we had said that Gregorius is with a kav, so for sure dates. Where for sure it's going to be sufficient with that amount, because the more chashav something is, the less you need to have of it. Like we said by peaches in contrast to apples, peaches only need 5 of them, because the more chashav you have it like a dessert, something special. Oh, this is like, everyone gets 1 piece of the tongue, So here also, so the Gemara, no, it's not a right. Because actually the Bryce Tomad, he's paying back lafi dam. So then what's the chiddush? What's the tevel bracha? It's $1 worth, and he gave back $1 worth. Who cares? It's less of the volume because he's paying the same amount of money. No, the difference is zvina. People just will buy dates, and therefore they'll sell quicker. That's a tevel bracha. But maybe actually in chashivas, maybe it's actually less chashiv than figs. And maybe you would actually need to have more than the kavan. There was no raya from that brayso. Then we said different measurements. We said we're going shtisa, roasted grain, and that dish you can make out of the flour of the roasted grain. It's different teachings. Abaye that said what my mother told me. One of them was regarding the roasted grain. But then we ended over at a very chashiv halacha regarding these halachas that we mentioned. We said whatever is a condiment itself, it's the amount that you'll eat with it. Meaning you don't have to have 2 meals worth of hummus, like we're saying. You have to have how much you would eat the bread with it. If it's not a condiment, meaning it's eaten by itself, you have to have how much of it you would eat. The whole meal has to be from that, which is like, let's say, by raw meat. Now, we had a machlekes regarding roasted meat, what would the halacha be? And we said there's no raya from the Persians, because they eat straight up roasted meat, so you see, you have to have 2 meals worth of that, because they're not the majority of the world. And like we find that halacha by the garments of poor people, that they're not dependent on the wealthy people. Everyone does by their own thing. We don't go based on that. And you can't say that, they were going stringently, because we find by the guy who has an appetite that by a medium-sized meal is how we evaluate it. Therefore, we see we don't go based on others even as a stringency. And therefore, if it's not the majority of the world, we're not going to go based on them. And therefore, we would not necessarily have to have the whole meals out of them. It seemingly would be sufficient how much you would eat the meat with bread, the roasted meat, on Shabbos. And that would be the measurement of the 2 meals. Thank you, Dr. for hosting us.